it's Mrs. Clemens.
And Mr. Marshall.
And this is U.S. History Flipped Review for test number 1. You have no choice. You better pass.
You will. You will
Yes.
pass. So we're going to start off with the early colonies. So the first question that you guys have in your packet and that we need to take a look at is how geography affected where people settled. And people need water. You have to have it. You need it to live. You need it to drink. You need it to grow crops. So people are going to make sure they're near rivers and coastlines. And you got to remember, they're getting off these boats from Europe and all these other places, so they need to be able to, get off the boat onto land and trade back and forth with where they came from. And mountains are just hard to live in, so they're not going to go there. Why were the plantations limited to the southern colonies? Because that's where they got this flat land, right? That's where you got the fertile soil. That's where it's, it's a lot warmer all year round down there. So it's just easier to grow. You come up here, we got mountains, we got rocky soil, and it doesn't work out as well. And then number 3, why did people in the North colonies, what did they do to make a living? Well, we made our money with much smaller farms and with a lot of trading and merchant work. Okay? So once you come up here, that's where you start to see a lot of people, buying and selling and sailing back and forth to different places to make their money that way.
All right, so now we're going to talk about our issues with Britain. So number 4, explain the concept of salutary neglect. What salutary neglect was basically the British, they had these laws, specifically the Navigation Acts, and they didn't enforce them. They let the colonies trade with whoever they wanted, even though that was not their law. How are the Mayflower Compact, the Virginia House of Burgesses, and the New England Town Meetings example of democracy? So the Mayflower Compact, that's in Massachusetts, Virginia House of Burgesses, oh my gosh, in Virginia. New England Town Meetings, again, holy cow, in New England. Even though they're in different parts of the country, they're all examples of democracy, that they showed that they wanted to rule themselves, and either they wanted to have representatives, like in the Virginia House of Burgesses, or they wanted to have direct democracy, like in the case of New England Town Meetings. Our next one is define mercantilism. Basically, you're going to have colonies, and you're going to get as much out of them as you can to benefit the mother country, whether it's raw materials, whether it's, well, all these things I was about to say are raw materials, but, trees, furs, indigo, all this stuff, mother country, baby, mother country. How did the colonists illustrate their opposition to British taxes and trade? Well, they protested a whole bunch. They boycotted, and they created the Sons of Liberty, our good friends with the Boston Tea Party. Explain the concept of no taxation without representation. Basically, guys, the no taxation part, yeah, it's not that they're mad about the taxes, it's the without representation. That they thought that, all right, if we're going to be taxed, we should be represented in the British Parliament. And so here's our first multiple choice question, which is similar to something you might see on the test. The creation of the Virginia, not the Virgin, I've seen if you're noticing, House of Burgesses and the signing of the Mayflower Compact show that American colonists, A, supported the abolition of slavery. Well, here's my thing for this one. You have to think about it. This is pretty early on in our history. Nobody's abolishing slavery. B, practiced elements of self-government. Okay, that might make sense. Promoted public education. It takes us a long time to have public schools, not until the 1800s, and we're in the 16 and 1700s with those things up above. Demanded immediate independence. No, because the Mayflower Compact was pretty early on too. It took them a while to get independence. So the answer is B, elements of self-government.
So now we start talking about some of the independent stuff. Right? Number 9 is all about this little pamphlet that Thomas Paine made called Common Sense, which it went all over the place. People read it and they were like, wow, this is actually really good. We should go and we should revolt, It was just about persuading people to be like, these are really good ideas. You should get behind it. And it was effective. It was pretty awesome. Right? What was the purpose of the Declaration of Independence? It's an actual question that shows up on Regencies. It's not a trick. It was to declare independence. And also to give the reasons that we wanted independence, to tell the rest of the world, look, here's all the reasons why Britain sucks and they're treating us horribly, so we're going to go do our own thing. Right? And that way the rest of the world could look at us and be like, oh, that makes sense. They're doing a good job. Right? What time period and ideas influenced the Declaration of Independence? Well, first off, the time period, the Enlightenment, right? And then all these ideas like the right to rebel, the consent of the governed, natural rights. You know, if the government isn't providing for us, then we should, you know, remove our permission and fight to change the government. You know, if they're not giving us our natural rights, our life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, you know, we need to change something with the government. It's just the way it goes. Right? And then what factors contributed to the victory of the Americans? We didn't have a lot of advantages, but we had some very key advantages when it came to the Revolutionary War. Right? We were fighting on the defensive. We had help from France. You know, we had a whole lot of morale just because we were fighting like on our doorstep. You know, we had to win. Right?
All right, so the Articles of Confederation, they're our first government. So 13, why were the Articles of Confederation created to be a weak central government? Well, they didn't purposely make a government to not work well. They purposely made it weak because they're afraid. They were really afraid that things would happen and be the same way as it was under Britain. They didn't want their rights taken away. And so they purposely made the national government weak so that that wouldn't happen. They didn't want to repeat their past. Give 2 examples of economic problems faced by the U.S. due to the Articles. Well, the first issue is coining money. Because the national government and all 13 states could coin money, you needed to exchange to go to New Jersey. That's just crazy. And then taxation. The national government couldn't tax, so it was broke. And they'd ask states for money, and states would say, no way. And then what was the Articles of Confederation? One achievement, the one good thing that they did was they passed this thing called the Northwest Ordinance. And so they're dealing with what was the Northwest, basically Ohio and Michigan and Illinois, Indiana. And it set requirements for territories to become states because we own them, but that area, but they weren't states yet. And it made slavery illegal in those areas specifically. You could do that multiple choice.
And then here's our next multiple choice. So we have one way in which the United States Constitution differed from the Articles of Confederation was that the Constitution, A, created a national government having 3 branches. Right? So is that one way that there was a difference between the 2 of them? Right? So we'll keep an eye on that. B, provided for the direct election of the president by the voters. C, made the amendment process more difficult. Or D, increased the power of the states. Right? So what did the Constitution do that was so different? So the correct answer here is definitely A. Right? It created a national government with 3 branches, because that's what the Constitution was all about. Right? More power to the federal government, and then split that power between different branches so everything stays balanced. Right? Now, it's also important to know why the others were not correct. So B, provided for the direct election of the president by the voters. We don't elect the president. You know, the Electoral College does that. You know, we influence it, but we don't actually elect him. C, made the amendment process more difficult. Right? There wasn't an amendment process before. Right? We actually created an entire amendment process so that the Constitution could change over time. Right? And then D, increased the powers of the states. It actually took power away from the states, so it can't be D either.
So there. All right, I'll do the next question. The government that was created under the Articles of Confederation lasted only a few years because the government, A, supported the extension of slavery into the Northwest Territory, so meaning that they thought, let's have slavery in the Northwest Territory. B, lacked the ability to enforce its authority. C, circulated a uniform paper currency, meaning that it's the same. Or D, compelled the states to abide by its treaties. And the answer is B, that it lacked the ability to enforce its authority. You know, it's just this weak government that only has 1 branch. It only had the legislative branch. There was no executive branch, and that just wasn't good. And no, we just talked about how slavery was not allowed to go there. No, we know that it was not uniform paper currency because there were 14 different types. And yeah, they couldn't make the states abide by anything.
Next we have the Constitutional Convention. The great compromise that shows up in every regent and you must know. This is all about representation. in Congress. Right? This is what created the bicameral legislature, those two houses in Congress. One, House of Representatives based on population, and then the Senate, which is 2 per state. And the next one was the 3/5. This was that horrible one with slavery, which doesn't exist anymore because slavery doesn't exist anymore. But this was about how much a slave counted for in terms of representation. So each slave was only 3/5 of a person. Okay? And then this way, the southern states kind of got a little bit more representation. And then number 18, we have the Federalist Papers. Okay? Now, these are a whole bunch of essays. They were put into like newspapers to really just persuade people to ratify the Constitution. Because people didn't know like why we needed a national army. You know, why do we need a president? You know, why is this stuff important? You know, and each one of these essays kind of focused on a different thing to persuade people. Right? And there are two groups. You know, you had the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists who liked the Constitution and the strong national government, and they were like, yeah, let's go ratify this thing. And the Anti-Federalists who were like, whoa, guys, take a minute here. Let's talk about this. Why exactly do we want our rights possibly taken away? Let's make sure we get a Bill of Rights so we always have them no matter what. You know, and the Anti-Federalists really wanted that Bill of Rights to make sure that we always have, you know, the freedom of speech and all the other stuff that we've been talking about. And then what it was written to serve what purpose? To guarantee those rights. The first 10 amendments, they give us a whole bunch of different awesome things. And then next multiple choice question. At the Constitutional Convention of 1787, delegates from the small states most strongly supported the idea of A, establishing a strong national executive, B, levying taxes on exports, C, popular election of senators, or D, equal representation for states the states in the national legislature. Right? So the correct answer we got here, since they're small states, okay, they're all going to want equal representation, you know, because that way, you know, they're not kind of, you know, getting hit because they're tiny. Right? They want everything to be equal, you know, 2 for each state. Right? And then the reasons the other ones can't be right is because, well, we're talking about delegates, so we're talking about representation. We're talking about small states. So, you know, establishing a strong national executive, that's not talking about delegates. That's not talking about representation in small states. B, levying taxes on exports. It's taxes. It's completely different. And C, popular election of senators. Yeah, that didn't come around for 150 years after the Constitution started, so it can't be that at this point.
All right, our next multiple choice question. The purpose of the 3/5 Compromise, which was adopted by the Constitutional Convention of 1787, was to A, balance power between the states with large populations and those with smaller populations, B, provide a means of deciding disputed presidential elections, C, allow Congress to override a presidential veto of an act passed by both houses, or D, reduce fear of loss of representation by southern states with large slave populations. So this is where you need to know what the 3/5 Compromise is. It's dealing with counting slaves, so it's D. They're really worried about losing that representation because otherwise they're only going to count the free population, which will mean that they'll have less people, which will mean that they'll have less representatives, which will mean that they'll have less power. When you know the definition, you just know it's got nothing to do with overriding a presidential veto. You know that they're not talking about presidential elections, and no, that doesn't make sense. All right, so we're hit our stopping point for our first part of review. Join us for the second part.